Welcome to the CEPR Macrohistory online seminar. Thank you everyone for attending. It's a real pleasure to have you here and to listen to our speaker today, so Monique Reiske. Monique is a PhD candidate at Humboldt University Berlin, and she specialized in quantitative economic history. So I'm really honored to moderate our seminar today and very grateful to Nathan Zussman and Rui Esteves for inviting me. I'm Emilie Sartre. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Nottingham. I work in political economy and I'm really excited about the paper Monique is going to present because she worked really close to my own research interests, so like on the impact of financial crisis and the right of the far right. But Monique does not study the 2008 financial crisis. She and her co-authors Thilo, Albers, and Felix Kersting go back to the Great Depression and show the role of debt deflation in the rise of the Nazi Party in rural Germany. So the paper is entitled The Political Cost of Debt Deflation, Agricultural Crisis and the Rise of the Nazi Party, and I really recommend reading it. So please don't hesitate as participants to ask questions in the Q&A during Monique's talk. If you have clarification questions, please flag them in the Q&A so I can interrupt Monique and ask her the question. And then after her talk, so for around 40 minutes, we will have a Q&A session. So the floor is yours, Monique. You have 40 minutes. And again, thank you so much for being here.
Right, so I've started a screen sharing. I hope this works. Yes, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present in this seminar. Thank you also to everyone for organizing and Emilie for chairing. So as you said, this is joint work with Thilo Albers at the University of Münster and Felix Kersting, who's also at Humboldt in Berlin, about the political costs of debt deflation, agricultural crisis, and the rise of the Nazi Party. And with that, I hope, yes, I can jump right into the motivation, which is just the observation that the defining feature of the Great Depression was, of course, deflation. And the economic consequences of this have been very well established. But what we ask in this paper is what were the political consequences of this deflation in the Great Depression, and why would we think that there will be any? Well, our hypothesis is that specifically through the channel of debt deflation, we can expect a radicalization of the electorate. Why would that be? Well, debt is, of course, denoted nominally, right, and thus stays stable also in times of crisis, in times of deflationary pressure. Whereas, on the other hand, due to declining prices, incomes as well as the value of assets that you might use to repay this debt lose out in value, such that it just becomes harder to repay this debt. And essentially, this represents a redistribution from debtors to creditors, which can lead to social conflict. At the same time as well, because you're in a period of crisis, there's limited policy space for the government to support pressure groups and grant compensation, which then can possibly lead to even ever more radical demands for political solutions. And we study whether this is the case by looking at the rise of National Socialism, specifically in rural Weimar Germany. And we argue that this is a good case to do this in because the Weimar Republic at that time was under specifically tight policy constraints, right? So we would expect here a sharp political response, and this allows us to study who precisely gains and loses out in such a situation. And of course, there's the data available to do this. And then additionally, the agricultural sector in the Weimar Republic experienced already starting in the 1920s, 2 consecutive crises that allow us to exploit plausibly exogenous variation, both in terms of debts and assets, to analyze the consequences of debt deflation. So very briefly, what we do in this paper is that we first look at this first crisis of debt accumulation, where we argue that driven by an import competition shock, German farmers at the agricultural sector accrued really a huge amount of debt very quickly, which led to demands for protectionism and other political changes, which went unfulfilled or not to the satisfaction of the electorate, leading to political discontent with the status quo, which we capture with the Young referendum in 1929. And to do this, we combine a county-level agricultural census with trade statistic and a classic shift share measure. And then we turn to the actual period of the Great Depression, which is, of course, defined by declining prices, leading then to debt deflation. And again, demands emerge for political changes. And here, the NSDAP is really the party that profits from this, whereas more traditional agricultural interest parties lose out. And again, we conduct here county-level analysis based on data on debt levels and assets, and exploit national-level price changes for identification. Okay, so with this, we contribute to two strains of literature, one generally on politics in the Great Depression, where, of course, much has been written about the general policy options that might have ameliorated the situation, but, of course, also on political constraints, right, that prevented the implementation of such measures. And also there are some between country comparisons of the general consequences of such crises. And here we add specifically the political costs of deflation via this channel of debt deflation. And then, of course, we also contribute to the literature on explanations for the rise of the Nazi Party, especially in recent years. Many different drivers have been investigated. Most closely related to us, of course, a recent interest in the Great Depression specifically, where authors have looked at German austerity policy and the 1931 banking crisis in between city comparisons, and then also at the consequences of the trade collapse. And so here we add another specific economic driver of Nazi support, and a particular focus on rural areas, which have largely been overlooked in previous quantitative research. Okay, so the rest of this talk is simply structured along these two crisis phases that I have previously outlined. So I will first show you the debt accumulation and its political consequences before we then turn to deflation and the rise of the Nazi Party. And at the very end, I will try to bring both of these together to gauge how important these crises were for the fate of the Weimar Republic. Right, so first some words about the agricultural sector in the mid-1920s. You can see on the left-hand side here, they plotted the agricultural debt stock on the national level between 1923 and 1928. And of course, in 1923, hyperinflation had essentially wiped out all debt. But very quickly over the following 5 years, farmers reaccumulated debt, reaching and even exceeding pre-World War I levels. And you can see here that this is largely driven by short and medium-term debt as well as mortgage debt. So even if we disregard some part of reinstated debt, pre-hyperinflation reinstated debt, you can still clearly see an escalation here in the debt levels, right? And so what were the potential or the drivers of this quick reaccumulation of debt were firstly, hyperinflation had, of course, not only wiped out debt, but also any liquidity reserves, both for farmers themselves as well as within the agricultural credit sector, that actually before World War I had worked very well with credit corporations providing credit from farmers to farmers. But after hyperinflation, these corporations actually turned from net creditors to net debtors, right? So there was a marked lack of capital, a lack of credit in the economy. So you had to rely on foreign credit, which was still scarce and only available at extremely high interest rates. So for especially short-term loans, interest rates upwards of 20% were really quite usual. And this capital scarcity met, on the other hand, large demands for liquidity, driven by various factors. One is the generally low productivity of the agricultural sector that, for example, in 1925, employed more than 30% of the workforce, while only producing 16% of GDP. So there was a marked need for investment, mainly to improve soil quality, as well as mechanization. Additionally, farmers faced increased tax burden and wage bill, at least compared to pre-World War I levels that, of course, needed liquidity. And then on top of that, you had increased foreign competition that kept or depressed prices and thereby potential profits for farmers that they might have used for investment purposes. And it's precisely this foreign competition that we exploit in our analysis for causal identification. You can see what has sometimes been even called a second grain invasion on the left-hand side here. So what is plotted are the German imports in million Reichsmark of the crops that are the most important for German agriculture in terms of cultivation area. And these are the imports coming from US, Canada, and Argentina. And you can see that even compared to 1924, you have a steep increase in the amount of those, more than tripling by 1927. Right. And this development is not mirrored by German exports, right? So here on the right-hand side, I'm plotting the total exports of these same products, which are smaller almost by an order of magnitude and do not exhibit that same trend. So now if we want to, of course, exploit this second grain invasion, we need to measure it on the county level and rely here on the established method by Otto and co-authors, where we use the agricultural census from 1925 and German import statistics to calculate an import shock for each county. So we take for each product a county's share in the German wide cultivation area of that product, shift this using the cumulative imports from 1925 to 1927, sum this up over all products, and normalize by county population. And then to ensure that we're actually capturing this import competition and not any demand changes, we also instrument for German imports using US agricultural exports to the rest of the world, which here is everywhere but Europe and North America. So by doing this, we deviate from the classic Otto and co-authors way of doing this in various ways. Firstly, we use area shares instead of employment shares, simply because employment by crops is not available, but we argue they are likely to be closely related. Then we take cumulative imports over these 3 years here instead of a single specific year, simply because in agriculture you might in any given year have idiosyncratic weather shocks that affect harvests, which may affect both imports and exports. So looking at 3 cumulative year here strikes us as a better balance. And then lastly, we're not subtracting anything from this because we argue that for the baseline period of these 10 earlier years, you had essentially, because of the First World War and the Allied blockade, followed by emergency economy, as well as hyperinflation, essentially no competition for German farmers in this market. So we argue that this can still be interpreted as a shock compared to an earlier period. So just some descriptives on this shock. On the right-hand side, you see it here by product in terms of Reichsmark per person. So you see the strongest affected be wheat, followed by animal feeding materials, barley, rye, and oats. And for orientation here, the average gross monthly wage of a German worker in 1925 was roughly 70 Reichsmark. So this is quite sizable in comparison, because you also need to keep in mind that this is per person in a county and not only per agricultural worker. So we can see here that it's likely to have consequences for the local economy. Right. Just some more on this trade shock. You can see it plotted on the map of Germany on the left-hand side in deciles, going from the least affected counties to the most in dark blue to the most affected in dark red. And you can see this is very concentrated in the east, north, and south, but also in the center and various other counties throughout. And if you compare this then to a similar plot for the agricultural employment share, you can also see that those are not necessarily the same. For example, here in the Northwest, you have agriculture, but this area is less affected by this shock. And so going forward, we always control for the agricultural employment share to also ensure that we're only exploiting variation within that sector for identification. So in order to do this, we run the classic straightforward 2SLS approach, where we instrument for German imports using the US exports to predict the county level import shock, and then use these predicted values to explain various outcomes, where we firstly look at economic outcomes to see whether this import competition really had economic consequences in a given county. So we look at change in income, then of course importantly new debt per capita, as well as a potential migration response, before we then turn to the political consequences, where we look at the support for the Young referendum, more on that in a minute, as well as already the NSDAP. We conduct this whole analysis in the rural sample, which we define here as those counties with an above median agricultural employment share. But just to make sure that we don't capture any noise coming from cities that might have had one or two fields. But you can be sure that our results also hold for alternative definitions of a rural sample. And then, as I said, we always control for the agricultural employment share, and then importantly for the political outcomes, we control for Protestantism, which has often been linked to Nazi support, as well as for the vote share that Hindenburg received in the 1925 presidential election, which is in the literature sometimes used as a indicator of anti-Republican sentiment already, and then we add constituency fixed effects that function here as a regional control. So with that, you're already the first set of results, which is the second stage of this IV estimation. And then you can see that with or without fixed effects, this import competition shock significantly decreased incomes to the tune of 1 standard deviation, explaining 24% of a standard deviation in income change. And this was compensated for by debt uptake, you can see here, where 1 standard deviation in the shock explains 46% of standard deviation in debt uptake. And you also see a slight migration response as well. Right. So with that, we've seen that indeed import competition can causally explain economic conditions at the time, or worsening economic conditions. And so now we turn to the political consequences of this. And we measure this, as I said, by relying on the Young referendum in 1929. So the Young plan, as you know, is the renegotiated debt or debt restructuring between the Allied forces and the German government. That was agreed on in 1929. And this referendum is an initiative of several right-wing organizations against this agreed plan. You can see an advertisement for this on the right-hand side here, where it says 69 years of tribute, so referring to the 69 years Germany would spend repaying this debt. Do you want to prevent this? Then participate in this referendum. And you can also see that this is targeted here, at least in this example, at a rural population. So what does this referendum actually propose? So it was a law that stated that Germany did not, in fact, have any war guilt and should therefore not repay any reparations, and that any government official who would sign such an agreement should be imprisoned as a traitor. So what they are doing here is essentially proposing to imprison the current government, which is why we argue that we can use this referendum as a very broad-based general indicator of discontent with the current political situation and anti-Republican sentiment. And then conveniently for us, the signature gathering phase for this referendum occurred in October 1929 and ended right before arguably the onset of the Great Depression, or at least the signal of the stock market crash. So we use the signatures as a share of eligible voters as our main outcome here. So first, in this analysis, we established that there's indeed a relationship between debt uptake and support for this referendum in an OLS setting, as well as a relationship between our import shock, which remains very similar when we then implement the IV estimation. This import competition shock increased support for this referendum, where one standard deviation explains roughly 9% of a standard deviation in signature shares. Then we also already look at the NSDAP here, and while we do not find a direct relationship from debt to NSDAP support, the import shock itself seems to have increased NSDAP support as well, though it's important to remember that at this point in time, the NSDAP really was a splinter group hovering around the 2% nationally. In this setting here, we also check for pre-trends, right? But just to see or to make sure that our import shock does not explain nationalist voting or proto-Nazi voting in earlier periods. And we conduct some shift share robustness measures, mainly by explicitly controlling for crop shares and also clustering standard errors on these shares. Then, as I mentioned, these results are robust to alternative sample definitions, spatial autocorrelation using Conley standard errors, and also alternative measures of support in the referendum. So far, we've seen that already in the 1920s, German agriculture was in crisis. There was an accumulation of debt that already led to discontent in the rural electorate. And with this, we now then enter the phase of the Great Depression with its declining prices and the rise of the NSDAP. You can see these declining prices plotted here on the left-hand side, again, for these 5 most important crops in terms of cultivation area for Germany, where prices are indexed to 1928. And you can see that most of these products massively lose in price until 1932, between 20 to even 40%, which is then very likely to affect farmers' incomes. Now, an additional factor that turned this already bad situation into an active crisis was that at the same time you have a drying up of credit, right? So of course, this is an international crisis. Foreign loans were recalled. You also have the 1931 banking crisis. And these developments essentially made it impossible to refinance existing debt and keep rolling it over. So you see a real increase in bankruptcies and foreclosures here for German farms. The government was, of course, aware of this critical situation, and agriculture is actually one of the sectors that received a lot of assistance from the Weimar government in various ways. One of them was the implementation of tariff and especially non-tariff barriers to trade, mostly applied to wheat. And as you can see here in the graph, and they actually succeeded in keeping the price of wheat at least at 1928 levels. But it was politically infeasible to do this for all agricultural products because, of course, this would mean higher food prices in a time of mass unemployment. The government as well gave tax relief to the agricultural sector. So after 1929, farm incomes were essentially tax-free. There was a massive subsidy and bailout program, the so-called Osthilfe, or aid for the East, on which by 1931 already the government had spent 2 billion Reichsmark compared to an annual average annual budget of 20 billion. And then lastly, the government also directly interfered with credit markets via presidential decree, capping interest rates and putting a moratorium on farm foreclosures. right? So with all of these measures, you still though see economic suffering in the rural sector, in the countryside, which we, of course, for our analysis, need to capture quantitatively, right, via this channel of debt.
Sorry,
Sorry.
Monique, sorry to interrupt you just slightly. We have a question by our
Yeah.
Chrome. I don't know if he wants directly to ask it, but it's about the identification strategy
Mhm.
and like the validity of the IV exclusion restriction. So, Orkun, do you want to ask it yourself?
Hi, sorry if this is not the right point in the presentation to ask this, but I was wondering because you have shown us this import shock that's affecting multiple economic outcomes, like including like income change, etc. And then now the argument is that we can use this import shock as an instrument to kind of catch the effect of debt on political attitudes, right? So then if it's affecting multiple outcomes, multiple economic outcomes, how can we ensure that, it's this debt channel that's really important here? So kind of exclusion criteria in the IB.
Yeah, so what I was just getting to for the second phase, right, for the specifically debt deflation, we actually employ a different identification strategy, but only referring to this first identification here. Of course, given these results, right? So we're not instrumenting with this shock here because precisely exclusion restriction might not be fulfilled, but we go directly from the shock to this outcome and argue just that here this debt accumulation is a likely contributor to this.
Right. So here we don't have a causal interpretation.
No, here we go from the shock to
Okay.
the outcome and argue that it's likely that this is related to debt uptake as well. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Orkun, and sorry, Monique. Please go on.
Okay. Right. So let me go back to this second phase where we want to look actually at debt deflation specifically. So as I said, we need to capture this on the county level, and we do this by looking at changes in the debt ratio, right? So the debt ratio is just the relationship of, in the numerator, the amount of debt that you have, and in the denominator, either income or assets that you can use to repay this debt. And let me just look at the change in this ratio between 28 and 32. For 1928, we have this data directly, right? So it's essentially the end result of this first crisis I showed you. This is the accumulated debt by that point. And so we just assume here an average interest rate yearly of 8% and project this forward, right, to generate the numerator for 1932. And then on the asset side, we make here use of the fact that what we have in the data as agricultural assets in 1928 are the tax values. And these were actually based on a capitalization methods where tax assessors went out, investigated the average profits of a farm and comparable farms in the surrounding areas over the past years. And capitalize this by a factor of 18 to get at a potential value of this farmland, right? So you actually have economic information in this value here. And we further make use of the close relationship of this measure to profits and thus also prices by calculating here a weighted price change for each county, where we take into account how important a given product is for that county and how much this product loses in price nationally, right? So independent of local conditions. So here, this is the national price declines as the plausibly exogenous source of variation. And we put this into the denominator then for 1932, which gives us a projected debt ratio in that year. And the difference between those two is our measure of exposure to debt deflation for each county. Just to ensure that we're actually capturing something of economic significance here, I'm plotting on the right-hand side our thus calculated measure of debt deflation, the change in the debt ratio between these 2 years, against the change in share of farms that are foreclosed on over the same period. And here you can see a clear positive relationship between the two, such that where there's more debt deflation, you see a larger increase in farm foreclosures. Now, unfortunately, this data is not available on the county level, right? So these are states and provinces. We can just plot them here, but still, I think this shows that there's a clear economic significance to this measure that we use here. Right. Now, before we get into the quantitative analysis of that, of course, need to see who is actually vying for the rural vote in this period. And the most important players here are the Nazi Party and other agricultural interest parties. And the Nazi Party really specifically targeted rural voters in their campaigning. You can see an example of this on the left-hand side, which is a screenshot from the party newspaper Der Angriff from April 1932, where it says here, peasants in crisis, who will help Adolf Hitler, right? And how did they promise to do this? Well, to the extent that there is a program, the Nazis promised protectionism to the extreme, right, even to the point of autarky, and also debt relief, right, essentially canceling agricultural debt were the promises that they made. And they combined this with a very efficient organization in the countryside, where essentially in all counties they had recruited advisors that could message back to the central party offices about the mood in the population and what people cared about and might like to hear, as well as that in their local counties implement Nazi instruction on ideology. And then additionally, the fact that in the countryside the issues of debt and interest payments were so salient really also slotted neatly into the Nazis' anti-Semitic propaganda. On the other side, you have these agricultural interest parties. The largest one of these, the Nationalist Conservatives, that had at least traditionally represented agricultural interests in the Protestant areas. They were part of the government for most of the Weimar period, and had actually succeeded in implementing some of these measures that I mentioned earlier, but potentially not to the satisfaction of their voters. And then additionally, you have regional agricultural protest parties that pop up around 1928. For example, the Landvolkpartei, but those really also remain very divided and splintery, right? So they never made a significant impact in government. Right. So how do we estimate this impact of debt deflation here? We do this with relying on a first difference model, where on the left-hand side we have the change in vote share. It's always valid votes as share of eligible voters for various parties and camps between 1928 and 1932, and we regress this on our measure of debt deflation. And of course, at various controls here, again, importantly, these constituency fixed effects, because a lot of these smaller parties really only ran in 1 or 2 constituencies, and as well as was the level of political organization. For example, party candidate lists would be published at this level. We additionally control for the initial vote share of any party or camp, the share of Protestants, and again, of course, the share of agricultural employment. So this is here just for completeness, the list of all of these special interest agricultural parties that were around at the time and that we combine in this group of farmers' parties. Okay, so this is the result of this first difference estimation for all the parties and camps in the political arena. Where firstly for the NSDAP, you can clearly see a strong positive relationship between this change in the debt ratio, right, so debt deflation, and support for the Nazi Party, where he won standard deviation in this debt ratio change, explains roughly 17% of NSDAP vote, which is about 2.5 percentage points. And this success or increased success of the NSDAP, where debt deflation was stronger, is mirrored by marginally larger losses for these farmers' parties to a comparable economic size as well. Whereas if you then look at all the other party camps, so here under Weimar coalition, we subsume the Social Democrats, the Catholic Center Party, and the Liberals. And here we do not see a clear relationship, neither for the communists, any other splinter parties, and also not for turnout. And so while there's of course still a danger of an ecological fallacy, we think this combination of results makes it very likely that what we see here is people turning from these farmers' parties towards the NSDAP in response to this debt deflation exposure. These results here are robust also to some measures of policy intervention. So we include here a dummy for all counties that were potentially affected by this Osthilfe aid program, and additionally control for the share of estates, so farms larger than 100 hectares. So accounting for land inequality, because these larger farms were potentially more likely to receive this aid as well. And we also account for the potentiality of a time-changing effect of specializing in crop production versus livestock. So again, these results are robust to other sample definitions and spatial autocorrelation, and also hold for later elections. Interestingly, here now for this crisis, we really do not see any migration response, right? Which is also plausible, given that it would be unclear as to where people might go. But really means that, yeah, the discontent here then was expressed really at the voting booth. Okay, so now before I conclude, let me briefly try to bring together these two crisis phases and understand how important they might have been for the fate of the Weimar Republic. So in order to do this, we conduct a counterfactual exercise, which of course, as all of these, has to be taken with some grains of salt. But essentially, we make here two assumptions. So let's imagine that in the 1920s, farmers had been able to only take up debt for investment purposes, right? So not to refinance old debt or to cover running costs. Contemporary estimates put this at roughly 21% of the actual accumulated debt. And so we use this and project it forward in the same way we did before. And then secondly, let's assume stable land values until 1932, so essentially no price declines here. This gives us a counterfactual debt ratio in 1932, which we then use, given our estimates from the previous analysis, to calculate a counterfactual rural vote share, which you see plotted on the right-hand side here. So these are all the national parliamentary elections between 28 and 33, separated into counties into urban counties in blue, rural counties in dark green, so actual observed results there, and then in lighter green, our counterfactual vote share, where you can then see that this is significantly smaller. It's roughly 8 percentage point, which even puts rural Nazi support below the urban level. Right, and then so very lastly, just to go beyond, a marginal effect, we ask what were potential consequences for majorities in parliament. So here we just translate this counterfactual rural vote share into actual number of voters, add these to the observed votes coming from urban areas, and thus calculate a counterfactual national vote share of valid votes, which is roughly 2 percentage points lower than what occurred in reality in 1932, but that might have been just enough for a majority coalition of all other parties against the Nazi Party and the Communists, potentially preventing a parliamentary gridlock. Okay. Just to briefly summarize, here, dysfunctional credit markets and foreign competition lead to fast debt accumulation and political discontent. And then during the Great Depression, debt deflation contributed to the rise of the NSDAP. Yeah, I think I've already run a bit over, so I leave it at that and look forward to your questions and the discussion.
Thank you very much, Monique, for this seminar. It was really wonderful and a very good paper. There are a couple of questions in the chat. Some general questions, like a bit more on the overall picture. The first one by Orkun about how should we compare inflationary and deflationary periods in terms of their potential to create conflict in a society? And Orkun was assuming that deflation would be relatively less harmful, given that losers will be debtors and asset owners who should still have sufficient wealth to continue with their lives. That's one of the questions. And another question by Eugenie, who had to leave, was about deflation and the fact it was not unique to Germany, so why it didn't have a similar impact on other countries at that time.
Yeah, for the question about the comparison to inflation, I think we would actually arrive at quite the contrary conclusion, where we see that even at lower levels, deflation can already have harmful consequences. And I think mostly, or at least in German context, and when looking then at political outcomes, people had previously focused on unemployment, right, as one consequence also of the economic downturn. And there you don't see a relationship to Nazi vote share here. But we make the point that for at least self-employed people, who in our case are farmers, but you might also think of people running businesses. It's very likely that they have debt, and on top of that, they also lose out on income during this deflationary period. And then just because there's a relative relationship between the two, having both essentially the numerator is stable, but it goes in an unfavorable condition, can lead, I think, to quite to economic hardship that is felt quite early. And then on top of that, any person who has a mortgage, for instance, is probably also likely to be affected by this, right? So you don't need to be a farmer. Though I don't think, in our specific setting, we can precisely compare, sizes of response here. I would just rather think, just to clarify that we look at the agricultural sector and they were largely affected, but they are not the only ones affected by this. And then the question of why Germany, not everywhere, I think always arises when we look at consequences or political consequences of the Great Depression, because of course it was an international crisis. I think we would add here that, while of course with our methods we try to isolate this one factor, in the end, it's a multifaceted explanation, right? So you also have to account, for example, for why it was so hard to actually implement efficient aid or to resolve this crisis, why it takes so long, and then also, of course, have a political supply side that you need to take into account. Had people rather stayed with the traditional representation, or even turned to these, or stayed with these protest parties that did not maybe have the same agenda, outcomes might have been different. Just that here, the party able to capitalize, because they also really focused on this area, was the Nazi Party.
And I think, thank you so much, Monique. I think Eugenie White, so he had to leave, but he had a bit a similar or related question. It was wondering whether Germany was not a special case because it had high food tariffs before World War I. And then, due to the Treaty of Versailles, it forbade Germany having any tariffs until 1925. So then it could be interpreted the fact they were blocked as they couldn't have those protectionist barrier may have played in favor of the Nazi Party at that time. Do you think so?
Yes, I do agree that the initial condition, or when we start our analysis at least of the agricultural sector here, was already pretty bad compared internationally, of course, right? So, one factor is this, how much are you used actually to protectionism, but then all these other factors as well of overexploitation of soil during the war, being behind on mechanization, all of this, of course, reinforces just this need for liquidity, which is met by scarce capital supply, right? So, which is why in Germany you see this massive increase.
Yeah, I think you're fully right. Like Caroline was, I think, a question a bit similar. Far-right groups tried to take power in the US, but they failed, and she was wondering why. I don't know if you have an answer about it.
Why far-right groups did not succeed in the US?
Yes,
At the time, of course,
I
there were
think that's what I know.
these movements, and also later directly, aided even by the Nazi government. I mean, it's a question of democratic resilience at some point you might get back to, which again leads me to this point of, well, first of all, what's the political supply like, right? Which, and how good are parties also at organizing, campaigning, etc. How do the incumbents act? All of these questions, of course, play a role, right? But I think also this type of question partly inspired this, exercise we do there at the end, of trying to figure out, what could potentially have happened in Parliament, and then seeing that, yeah, maybe it just, 2 percentage points smaller for one party could potentially, if it prevents a gridlock, lead to a completely different outcome, right? So you have, if you like this critical juncture type of idea here.
Yeah, and so like there are a couple of questions I was wondering myself. One by Orkon about the lack of effect on turnout in your main regressions, and he was thinking maybe people didn't radicalize, they just like switched their votes from the former party to the NSDAP because it was looking like an alternative that could potentially help them at that time. So yeah, how can you explain this lack of an effect on turnout? Is it also because some people abstain and those people were traditionally voting for mainstream party? I know it's difficult to have empirical evidence on that without any surveys or any
Yes,
very
I
specific
suppose.
data, but like, do you have any idea?
Yeah, so let me first of all say that I was actually also surprised by this non-effect on turnout, because also in the literature it's much discussed that the Nazis were specifically good at mobilizing people, right, and succeeded with previous non-voters, and so I had actually expected to see something there. So that's the one thing. And then, yes, as I said, our interpretation is that people did switch from these farmers' parties to the Nazi party. And I think in how far you then define this switch as a radicalization is really up for your own interpretation, right? So you might say it's not radicalization because it's just, jumping from one option that didn't work, where they were in government, they didn't fulfill. I try the next, up and coming protest vote. Or you might say, no, this is actually radicalization because what I'm voting for is a party that promotes autarky and uses anti-Semitic propaganda, right? I think it's a matter of interpretation.
And also a bit related to that, so you show this result of the NSDAP vote in 1928, and you find this like this slight increase. I was wondering at that time, did you also observe an increase in abstention, for instance, or a decrease in farmers for the Farmers Party vote share or any other party?
Abstention is actually a good question. I don't think we've looked at that. Though on the national average turnout, especially given how many elections there were in this period, was generally really high and quite constant, but there might have been some systematic relationship. We haven't actually looked at that. And for these other parties, we actually did not find that at that point in time. Yeah, which is also why I think we mainly focus on this more general level of discontent in the young referendum, really capturing everybody who was dissatisfied for various reasons and had maybe not yet sorted into which party represents this dissatisfaction best.
Yeah, but in the case you find like no effect on the other political parties, it's possible, I don't know, that you have an effect on less abstention and more like an increase in turnout, which would mean that disengaged voters like turn out to vote, which is something that happen in the populist literature. I don't know, anyway, even a very interesting effect. There is also another question that I was wondering. It's about any heterogeneity regarding state capacity and like the places that used to refer some fiscal aid, some subsidies. Did they have like less vote share in the end for the NSDAP, or was it totally inefficient, those kind of policies at that time?
Well, unfortunately, our only way that at least we've come up with to measure, actual aid is actually this Oster for dummy. To include this, so we really investigated whether we could find actual data on how much was spent per county in aid, etc. But we're not able to find. It's just a list of counties where aid was implemented. And then you can see here that including just the dummy indicator of that essentially does not change anything about the support. Yeah, because we of course also had this question. Yes.
Yeah, no, that's and also like more generally in the literature at that time you had several other factors that could explain the vote for the Nazi Party. You have this paper by Doer and this co-author about the failure of Bank. I don't know if it was more like a urban phenomenon and so not something that could have like play a role with the farmers at that time.
Yeah, so in this data they use a between city comparison. I hope I'm not mistaken about this. So we can't, actually take this data and use it ourselves and to make a comparison there. And we also do not have any, actual information, at least on a county level, as to where exactly these farmers were indebted and which types of banks or organization were they directly affected by these bank failures of these banks. I think just rather indirectly, of course, a banking crisis is then likely to further reduce the supply of capital, making it harder to refinance this debt. Yeah, but I don't think in our setting we can, precisely compare sizes of these effects. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's. I think it would be a bit difficult empirically. I think Nathan as a question.
Yeah. Yeah. So I really enjoyed the paper. I have a question regarding controlling for spatial autocorrelations. I mean, since the shocks you show are highly concentrated in the debt, so and this is rural areas, of course. So there probably maybe some kind of propagation mechanism which is spatial. So did you control for that? And any
so what we
look
do
for
in terms
hotspots in terms of these things? These
Okay.
kind of standard.
Okay. The only thing I can offer you so far is this classic Conley standard errors that even decrease with the clustering. But I'd be interested in hearing what you would like to see there. Maybe we can discuss later if this is not convincing.
No. So this is something. Yeah. I mean, it's looking at hotspots of these things, more anxiety, those kind of more.
Okay.
That would be interesting to see. Kind of. Is it particular to certain regions, certain hotspots? I mean, because they're dispersed. I mean, you show they're dispersed, and you're controlling for constituency fixed effects and all these things. But still, it would be interesting to see. Kind of.
Yes.
I don't think it will overturn any results. Just make it a little bit more.
Yeah. I mean, where are here? I mean, on our sample maps, I'm not sure how well you can see this, right? So in gray, those would be our rural samples. And so you're asking if within these rural counties we still see these specific hotspots that spill over then.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Can have a look at that. Thank you.
I think Caroline has a question, like a speculation. I don't know, Caroline, if you want to ask her directly.
Oh, sure. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. That was follow up on the point Eugene made, and then I said about comparing with the US, just speculating. I was wondering about speculation, but you covered that. But my more recent question was how your indicators, and maybe you covered this, I didn't see it, compare with the austerity measures. That didn't come out very well. The measures in the paper from a few years ago about austerity measures that have geographical variation as well.
Yeah, I think
The paper in the JEH, I'd have to look it up.
Yes, no, I think I know which one you're referring to. If I remember correctly, so we're talking within Germany now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So then I know the paper you're talking
It's
about.
in the JEH, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
To answer this narrowly, we again can't directly compare because it's a very different setting. Again, they have between city comparisons there. But I think the bigger picture is that actually when we look at the rural area or specifically the agricultural sector, I would argue this was actually not one affected by austerity measures, precisely because the government, spent 2 billion on a bailout program and really tried to assist by capping interest rates, also again essentially making farm incomes tax-free, etc. And then I think the interesting thing is that still with these types of measures, you see where economic hardship and this dissatisfaction in the electorate.
I see. Right. So there's also work on hyperinflation and monetary policy, and everyone's trying to link to the rise of everyone wants to find the magic explanation for.
Of course, yes.
So yeah, I think it's interesting, and it would be important to compare all the different influences, and obviously this is one, but there are other competing explanations. So it'd be good to be able to sort of untangle all of that.
Yes, no, I think you make a very good point there, right? I mean, you see already from the literature slide here, right, how much has been done, especially in the recent years and quantitatively. And I think, first of all, of course, we acknowledge, right, that this is not a monocausal explanation will probably not be possible, right? It's pretty complex occurrence, though I agree that it would be very interesting to put all of these explanations, together in one framework and one data set and really understand which is the most important
back
driver.
But back to the comparison with the US, I think one political structural difference that might have been even critical is the pretty much two-party system in the US with single member districts, and we don't have a parliamentary system, whereas in Germany, just getting a small-ish percentage got the Nazi Party a foothold, and then it increased. And as everybody knows, even school children, the Nazis never got a majority, right?
Yeah.
We learn all that. But in the US, they would have had to have a majority. So it might have actually been similar in the US, and that would be an interesting comparison.
Yes.
That the support there were literal Nazis in the US at the same time.
Yes.
And there's a lot of historical research recently about far-right parties. It would be interesting to actually compare that. Not in this paper. I'm not telling you to add this to your paper. But I just think it would be really interesting because it could actually put that to rest, that it maybe, Germany wasn't unique.
Okay.
It was just, which goes to show you just how fragile the situation can be. And, sometimes something tips the balance.
Yeah, I mean this question of having these very small parties and already like with one MP represented in parliament, right? And that is a lesson that I think was very quickly learned by politicians than in the Federal Republic of Germany, right? So the argument goes less, I think, about the NSDAP and getting a foothold, but just that you have this real splintering of the whole political spectrum, right? Where you have, which just makes coalition building also harder than in parliament if you have 30 different parties represented. And so, in the Federal Republic, and still now today, we have a threshold of at least 5% that parties need to reach, right? It's one lesson that was learned there. But of course, directly comparing, parliamentary systems to this, two-party system is, I guess, can be instructive as well. Of course.
Right.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, Monique, for this interesting question and answer. Just I want to remember everyone, so it's like 5 p.m. We can continue with more an informal discussion. And I want to remind you of the next speaker in 2 weeks, so on December the 3rd. It will be Cameron Lapons from Yale University, and he will present his paper with Gustavo Cortes. Housing is a financial cycle, evidence from 100 years of local building permits. So we can continue the discussion in a less informal manner. I don't know, Caroline, if you have another question or reaction about the paper.
No, I asked my question.
Okay,
Thank you.
yeah, good. I think like Francesco had a question about, so he read that the NSDAP won elections in the German regions where the banking crisis of 1931 hit harder. It seems that your debt deflation explanation could be complementary. I was thinking a bit like, in a similar manner, whether those people were not like more exposed to the financial crisis in other ways than just debt. I guess you started a bit answering that, we can have many mechanisms, but I if you want to answer in more details.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I understood the question correctly. So it's back about, is this the precise mechanism, or can you also be otherwise exposed?
Yes, and potentially other complementary mechanisms that I guess in the end makes the effect look bigger, particularly if some regions are affected by debt deflation, but also hit harder by the financial crisis itself.
Yeah, which would then lead to also more firm bankruptcies, potentially unemployment, etc. Yes, I mean it's a valid point, right? I'm I'm not sure. Maybe we should have a bit of a look at what other type of data we can find there, to narrow this down, though. I mean, of course, at least when it comes to the sectoral income, those are related, right? So we have, income as part of the debt deflation measure, right? Or losses in profit, at least when it comes to this sector. And I don't think we could, probably ever be really able to disentangle, in this aggregated setting of counties, right? How much is a farmer exposed to debt and how much is a shop owner also affected by, maybe a bank failure and decreasing, people spending less at his shop, etc. So I think that's just this is a general challenge of having in the setting only aggregated data, I would say.
And I think Francesco was mentioning as well another book. I don't know, Francesco, if you want to mention it yourself. No. Yeah, it's just mentioned about a reference in a book that could help you, but I guess you can exchange emails about it after that. I will send you Monique his contact. And about this effect, I was also, you can have many other co-mechanisms for your impact, but you have all this literature explaining that the Nazi party gained support in places where they were initially already a stronger anti-Jewish feeling? Can you, I don't know, like, can you get some data about that even at the aggregate level and check if you cannot have like, a multi-exposition of this, of those places, or just only these channels that, debt deflation as explained?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's the paper by Voigtländer and Ford on this, a very long run anti-Semitism, actually attached their data to our sample. It just decreases the number of observations so much that we were unsure what exactly we can learn from this, or from, I don't think we found anything, but then we weren't sure about what does that tell us? And then also what we did was try to see whether there's like heterogeneous effects just along the number of Jewish population, right, in that type of setting. But again, we run into the problem that most Jewish people actually lived in cities, so we have very little exposure generally. And from what we had, we actually did not find any effect. Or anything significant. No, it's actually interesting because for Nazi propagandists, or at least I've also seen reports on this in the archive, they were very, well, let's say, I don't know if you should say concerned, right, but wrote a lot about Jewish cattle traders as prying on the innocent German farmer. And that this should be abandoned. But there's also historical work in like at least regional case studies actually pointing out that in a lot of cases, German farmers had a really close relationship to these cattle traders, and actually would not, even after the Nazis gained power, abandon them. So I think it's maybe even unclear as to what direction the effect would be, which also could explain why we don't do anything. But yeah, we also we don't have any explicit data on these traders, where they were active or anything like that. So,
but still, it could be interesting to see that like debt deflation for those farmers was potentially the strongest mechanism why all those campaigns against Jewish were potentially like having more impact on urban places. So anyway, even if you don't find potential impact, it could be.
yes. Yeah.
It could be added to the paper. And another question I was a bit wondering when I read your paper. So if I understand well, those farmers increased their debt prior to the financial crisis because also they wanted to make investment. Can you find that in the places where the investment was the most efficient, like their capital gains, their benefit compensated for partly for the debt deflation, and those people were less likely to vote for the Nazi party as a result?
Unfortunately, we did not find any, county level information on the actual investment spending, and then even less so how effective that would be. It's really the only thing we have is this contemporary estimate of generally people spend 21% on an investment, and not for any other purposes. And even then, I think the general consensus at the time was, even if it was spent on investment, was often very ineffective. But to my knowledge, we don't have the data to test this.
Yeah, and I guess you cannot check, like, for instance, their portfolio of people who were like more exposed in terms of their financial asset to the crisis, and whether they were still more likely to be located in those rural places and affected by the shock. I guess it might be as well difficult to collect data.
Yeah, I mean, you would have to start from the other side, from having individual portfolios, right? And then, try to geolocate them. I mean, there is work by Jochen Streb and Sibylle Lehmann-Hasemeyer on savings, at least in this period, where they have individual records about this. But I'm not sure if the corresponding also credit information, etc., would exist. And then also, if you only have these savings books, right, it's not a portfolio. Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Anyway, there are many co-mechanisms I could play, but like debt deflation look like a strong one. I think Wu has a question.
Yes, since there's still time. So first of all, thank you very much. This is a super paper, and thank you for bringing it to us. I don't know if it's a question or it's a speculation related to what Caroline also asked earlier on. So you want to make a case that this was a make or break effect, right? So were it not for this, it would have been possible to create a blocking majority, right, against the extremes.
Potentially.
To my, amateur knowledge of German political history of this period, it seems that effectively what the effect that you identify shows is that there was some internal cannibalization of the right-wing vote, right? So essentially what I'm asking, by shifting votes from the traditional, say, Catholic, rural-based party to a close substitute with more nationalistic and less religious overtones, did you really change the political balance, as opposed to what would have happened had, the NSDAP not be able to, get the votes from the working class in urban areas, right? So because we all know that how Hitler came to power, with this, failed Faustian deal that the rest of the right thought they could control it, right? So you got the question.
No, I mean, I think, of course, the argument we're making there is very indirect, if you like. I think we rather started from a point of we just want to see whether any kind of marginal effect we've isolated could even potentially have national consequences, right? Just to understand how important of a driver it is. Of course, then there still remain many unknowns, right? I mean, first of all, is our counterfactual scenario in any way realistic? Then even if it had been at least mathematically possible to have a majority against the Nazi Party, would people have succeeded in negotiating one, right? Would that discipline have been there? And then so on it goes, right? If you have, maybe I think the positive interpretation would be, yes, maybe they would have succeeded, and then that could have prevented, this continuation of presidential decrees and maybe even this deal. But potentially also not. It's just that our counterfactual scenario here at least allows the mathematical possibility of that, where in reality it was not possible to have a majority against the Nazis and the communists. I think that's rather the point that we want to make there. But of course, I mean, also it was mentioned earlier, this adage of, the Nazis were never voted for, right? They were Hitler was installed as chancellor, but there are, of course, background condition, parliamentary conditions that allowed this to happen in the first place, right? And the Nazi Party still was by far the strongest party. So again, it's a lot of room for speculation. I think we rather just wanted to get a handle on if there's any way that the driver we've identified here actually affects national outcomes.
Yeah, but even today, right? So, all the political speculation is what the traditional center-right parties will do as the extreme right grows and cannibalize them, right? Will they try to, as in Germany today, right, stick to the center by reaching out to the center-left, or are they just eventually, like in the Netherlands, going to get, or Austria, right, going to try to get in power with the extreme right? So that's, fantastic. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Monique. It was a really great seminar. We're nearly at 5:15. So Francesco, I think, found the book he was mentioning earlier. I don't know if Francesco wants to talk as well. I will unmute him. But the book is about the German slump, Politics and Economics, 1924-1936 by Harold James. I don't know if you read this reference. He mentioned as well another paper, but the one we mentioned earlier, I think, about Danet Bank in Germany. I'm checking, I don't know if anyone else wants to ask any other question. If they
I think we're happy.
Okay. That's it. Okay, thank you so much, Monique, for this wonderful talk, for everyone for your questions. It was a real pleasure. Thank you, thank you, Nathan, for organizing it. And see you in 2 weeks with another speaker and another share.
Thanks,
Thank you
Emilie,
from
as
me
well.
as well.
Thanks, Monique. See you around.
Thank you, Emilie. Thank you, Monique.